Julian Strawther looks like a potential first-round pick thanks to his outside shooting and rebounding skills, so let's discuss what his best and worst-case NBA draft scenarios might be right here on the Locked On Zags podcast.
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is going on, y'all? Welcome to the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Andy Patton, here to bring you news and updates on all things Zag athletics. Today's episode of the Locked On Zags podcast is brought to you by Bird Dogs. Go to birddogs.com/LockedOnCollege. And when you enter the promo code Locked On College, they will throw in a free custom Bird Dogs Yeti-style tumbler with every order. All right, folks, we talked about Drew Timme on Tuesday's episode of the Locked On Zags podcast, his pros and cons, the things he does the best in the modern NBA, the things he maybe needs to work on, some ideal landing spots for him, some less than ideal landing spots for him, and we rounded it all out with a prediction for what his first professional season might look like. And we're doing the same exact thing, same format here for Julian Strawther on Wednesday's episode of Locked On Zags. We'll round out the week discussing these two players once more on Thursday's show with a special guest. And then, of course, we'll talk about where they actually ended up for Friday's show to wrap up draft week here on Locked On Zags. So I want to talk about Julian Strawther and specifically want to talk about the things he does the best, the things that make him the most appealing draft prospect, and what are some kind of best case scenarios that might shake out for him between Thursday and the end of his rookie season. So for Julian, the obvious pro is the shooting. I think when you look at the modern NBA, when you look at what teams are coveting right now, there are a lot of different things, but at the end of the day, your ability to make open threes is one of the biggest, most appealing things. NBA teams are driven by the three-point shot. That more and more we're seeing that be the focal point of offenses throughout the NBA, throughout college, throughout high school. It's just a part of the game at this point. And for Julian, that's something he has demonstrated without a shadow of a doubt that he can do consistently. Julian shot just under 41% last year on about 5.3 attempts per game. As his production increased, as he was asked to take on a bigger role in Gonzaga's offense, as he was asked to take more shots, we saw his efficiency improve, which is a tremendous sign for him as his growth in basketball has continued. He has not gotten worse. Most guys, higher volume, lower efficiency. That's not unsurprising, nor is it really even super negative. But when you see a player who improves their efficiency while also having a bigger volume of shots, that's a really tremendous sign of growth and maturity and development for Julian from his third season at Gonzaga. He's a career 38.4% three-point shooter. So while that 40.8% was the best mark of his career, he's been solid for all of the time that he spent in Spokane. Again, career 38.4 on 4 attempts per game. And just from an eye test perspective, Strawther very clearly demonstrated the ability not just to hit catch and shoot threes, not just corner threes. He hit catch and shoot threes. He hit corner threes. He hit threes off the dribble. He hit NBA range three-pointers. He hit clutch three-pointers. You all don't need me to tell you that. 2 of the biggest shots literally in program history came from Julian Strawther last year, that big 3 against UCLA, of course, to send them packing, and that big 3 against BYU in the final game on the road against BYU while they're a member of the WCC. For Strawther, that clutchness, he also had a pair of clutch threes against Xavier last season. I don't know how much teams are going to draft him based on a few clutch shots necessarily, but it's always nice to see a player who can step up in those moments. And for Julian, what we saw from him was a player who was completely willing to take the shots necessary, who had no hesitation about being ready for those shots, and really just didn't have a lot of fear about where he was on the court, what the time was, what the situation was. If he got a look that he thought he could knock down, he was going to take the dang shot. And more often than not, he was knocking that thing down. And I think that's a skill that NBA teams are just salivating to add to their roster. For Julian, I think that outside of the three-point shooting, the obvious skills that stand out are the floater game. is one that's gotten mentioned for him quite a bit, and for good reason. He had I believe Synergy Sports does some rankings for your overall percentile in various different offensive and defensive categories. And for Strawther, his floater, I believe, was in the 91st percentile among college basketball players last year. He was, and Mark Few and the staff really emphasized these floaters. They talked about wanting to hit them at about an 80% clip. I doubt the team actually made them at that high of a clip. That is astronomically good. But Julian Strawther was absolutely excellent at finding space, finding a little bit of wiggle room, a little bit of gap, a little bit of a gray area in the defense, getting to the spot he wants to get to, and then putting up that little baby teardrop floater and knocking it down. Very, very good skill, a coveted skill in the NBA where floor spacing is even bigger. The court is bigger. The three-point line is longer. There's more room to operate in the middle of the floor. And for Julian Strawther, who is going to be relied upon as kind of a catch and shoot 3-point guy, if he can prove that, hey, I caught the ball, I pump faked, I got a defender in the air, I took 2 dribbles, and now I have to be able to convert from here. Because if I can take these 2 dribbles and get into traffic and then I'm not able to make the shots, then you're kind of just going to get relegated to catch and shoot threes. But if he can prove, hey, I can put the ball on the deck, I can get to a spot, I can make a shot. This is something that Corey Kispert, who will forever be connected to Julian Strawther, they are similar in a lot of ways. And Strawther, of course, replaced Kispert as the starting small forward. But that's one thing that Kispert has really shown throughout the first couple of years of his NBA career is he's not just a standstill 3-point shooter. There's a little bit more to his offensive game. And Strawther's going to be coming into the NBA having already showed a little bit more of that in some ways. For him to kind of reach his upper threshold as an NBA player, he'll need to prove that he can make those shots consistently. But by all accounts, there's little reason to doubt that he'll be able to do that. More pros for Julian Strawther. The rebounding, of course, is a big one. He's a prolific positional rebounder. He's drawn comps to Josh Hart, who's had a very excellent NBA career up to this point. I'm not sure that Julian will reach that upper echelon. That's kind of the best case scenario for him as an NBA player. But in terms of a guard who's a good rebounder, who gets to his spots, who's got a nose for the basketball, Josh Hart definitely has that skill set. Same with Strawther. Julian's also very active on defense, and he has good size and speed for playing the small forward role. And I think it's easy to project future success for him defensively, although we'll talk a little bit more about some of the defensive stuff in the second segment. The best case role for Julian in the NBA is a contending team that's willing to give him a role right away. This is what you're always looking for. If you're not going to be one of the 5, even 10 top players selected in the NBA draft, finding a team that's going to put you into a role where you can succeed and a team that is competing for a NBA championship, that's the lottery. That's the thing that you want coming into the draft. You want to compete for a championship and have a defined role where you can continue to grow and develop as a basketball player. There are clearly a few situations Julian could land in where those needs would be met. I think going in the late first round would be ideal for Julian Strawther. Obviously, Gonzaga fans want to see him go in the first round. You always want to see your players go in the first round. Andrew Nembhard proved last year that there's a lot of success not necessarily going in the first round. First pick in the second round was an all-NBA, all-rookie caliber performer. He just missed that second team, but I think for Julian, going in the late first round or in the early second round, somewhere where there's a team that could really use him in a specifically defined role would be ideal. I don't think you're going to see him before 22. I think that is probably the absolute highest he would go. I don't think he's going to go that high, but I think that's where you could at least start seeing his name realistically start showing up, at least on those mock drafts. Memphis at 25. Is a really nice fit, although that's not a huge need for the Grizzlies. They're more likely to look for a big to help replace Brandon Clark, who's going to miss the start of the season, maybe even a guard to help replace John Morant, who's also going to miss the start of the season, albeit for very different reasons. Utah at 28 makes some sense as well, depending what they do with their first few picks. If they end up with somebody like Grady Dick, they're probably not going to take Julian Strawther in that spot. Same with Orlando, who has a second-round pick that I think could be appealing for Julian. But they're also being attached to Grady Dick a lot, and those two players are probably just too similar for them to necessarily grab as well. Also, the Clippers at 30 is a spot I have seen Strawther mocked to, and I think that would be a nice, fun fit for him as well. Well, Strawther has some work to do to be a complete NBA player. We're not just saying that he's done and ready to roll right now. There's still some work to be done, and we're going to discuss what those things are, as well as what scenarios we maybe don't want to see Julian find himself in his first NBA season. All that coming up after a word from today's sponsor, Bird Dogs. I don't know how else to say it, so I'm just going to keep it simple. Bird Dogs shorts and pants they make you look good. The Bird Dogs stretch khaki shorts are designed to fit slimmer through the thigh and leg, giving you a truly sculpted look, and we could all use that help. They also fit just like Lululemon, but they fit even better. They also fit better than regular shorts made of stiff, restricting cotton. How? Bird Dogs fixed it by inventing cloud knit fabric that looks just like khaki but stretches so that you get a slimmer fit without sacrificing movement. It also uses anti-stink sweat wicking fabric that helps keep you cool and dry all day long. So go to birddogs.com/lockedoncollege and enter the promo code LockedOnCollege for a free Yeti-style tumbler with your order. That is birddogs.com/lockedoncollege for a free Yeti-style tumbler. You will not want to take your Bird Dogs off, I promise you. Bird Dogs, a proud sponsor of the Locked On Podcast Network. Well, folks, don't miss the Locked On NBA Draft live on Thursday night, pick-by-pick analysis from our stable of local NBA hosts, national reaction from our NBA Big Board hosts, and live check-ins from inside the NBA Draft. Locked On NBA Draft live starting at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time on the Locked On NBA YouTube page. All right, folks, we talked about some of the pros of Julian Strawther's game and what he is bringing into the NBA. I want to talk a little bit about some of the stuff that he may still have to work on, some of the stuff that is going to go in the negative column of his scouting report, and talk about some team fits or some potential role fits that might be a bit more problematic for him in year one were they to come to fruition. The cons for Julian Strawther, I think the biggest offensive issue for the most part, he's a well-rounded offensive player, but finishing around the rim and drawing contact seems to be areas that we didn't really see him mature. Again, the floater game was a really impactful, important development for him in terms of adding more to his bag and giving him more of a more well-rounded, developed offensive game. But he used the floater so much that what we didn't see was him going into the chest of a big man, finishing through contact, drawing a foul, getting an and one. Like, those weren't things that we often saw Julian Strawther doing. And I think that there is an argument that, well, if he's got a really good floater, why not just use that instead of drawing contact and having a more difficult route to getting your points? But you need to be able to do both, I think. And for Julian, there is some question of like, hey, in the NBA against bigs, against talented front court players, is he going to be able to score around the rim, or is he kind of limited to 3-point shooting, mid-range shooting, and not a ton else? He had 3.6 free throw attempts per game last year, career 2.5 free throw attempts per game. Just not a guy who really got to the line a ton. Again, that's a little bit of a nitpicky offensive thing, but it is something that if he were to work on that, if he were to demonstrate that he could finish through contact, that would help elevate his game at the NBA level. Beyond that, I think the biggest offensive thing outside of that is just facilitation, distribution. And part of that is that he wasn't asked to do that. His role at Gonzaga was pretty clear as the secondary scorer. Get the ball in his hands, let him go to work, let him score. He wasn't being asked to run the offense, to play point guard, to move guys around. That wasn't his role. And I think one thing that is a positive for Julian Strawther is that he's very good at playing within his role. Something that I think will serve him very well at the NBA level. But he's also a guy who had more turnovers than assists pretty consistently. And I think for NBA teams, you'd want to see him be a little bit better at making those right reads and making good passes and doing that stuff. Again, not a huge deal breaker for him. We're not talking about a top 10 or top 15 guy in the draft anyway. But I do think it's something that he could stand to improve that would probably help get him on the floor longer at the NBA level. Other con stuff, his athletic testing numbers were not great this year at the NBA Draft Combine. They were better last year. So I'm not sure how to reckon with that. I'm not sure what exactly that means, whether there was an injury at one point or whether the numbers just didn't bear themselves out very well this year. But it does raise a little bit of concern about his defensive profile. I think when you read the scouting reports on Strawther right now, a lot of the praise about his defense is theoretical, if that makes sense. You see a lot of reports that say, with his size and length and athleticism, he projects to be a good defender at the next level. But we haven't necessarily seen definitive proof that he can be a great defensive player. Some of this is not his fault. Gonzaga did not run a very good defense last year. They just didn't. And there were issues with the rest of the roster construction, not having a really significant lockdown perimeter defender, not having a rim protector. It made Julian's job defensively more difficult. And you don't want to hold that against him. And I do think that these theoretical, hey, he's probably a guy who can be a good defender because of his athleticism. I don't think that that's wrong, but I think that just kind of checking that box and saying, well, he'll be good on defense and moving on is not exactly the way to go. I think there's still some fairly, like, he's projected as this 3-and-D wing that you can carry on to the next level and just kind of pencil in as, hey, 10, 15 minutes per game, his outside shots, play good defense. And I think there's concern about that second thing coming to fruition, because if you are a 3-and-no-D player, you tend to not stick. You don't tend to make it very often. I mean, even the best three-point shooters, Kevin Huerter is a great example for Sacramento, really dynamic offensive player for them, who they basically had to bench throughout the playoffs because his defense was a liability for them. I would hate to see Julian Strawther become that kind of player. And I think for him, I would focus entirely on improving defensively, because the offensive game is already there. But the defense has to be good enough to keep you on the floor. Otherwise, it doesn't matter how good your offense is. It doesn't matter how good your shooting is. You will get played off the floor if you cannot consistently defend at the NBA level. And it's hard. It's really hard to do. So it'll be interesting to see if Julian can make the necessary development there, necessary growth to become at least a above average defensive player. It doesn't need to be elite, but an above average defender, or even a league average defender, is enough for him to carve out a legitimate NBA role. Some of the worst case stuff for Julian Strawther that I think could happen is kind of similar to what we talked about with Drew Timme on Tuesday's episode: getting drafted by a team that doesn't have room for him to play a role. A team drafts him. He's third string small forward, fourth string small forward, kind of 12th man on the bench, not getting a lot of G League opportunities, but just kind of stuck, buried on the bench in the NBA. That's kind of the no man's land that nobody wants to be in. It would be more ideal for Julian Strawther to be in a situation where he is playing every day in the G League, or playing consistently in the G League, rather than just being buried on the bench and not really developing all that much at the NBA level. I don't think that's going to happen. Most teams, if you're going to use a second round pick on a guy, you're either going to play him in the NBA or you're going to play him in the G League. There's not a lot of guys just getting buried. Usually, if they're the guys that are buried on your bench at the NBA level are veteran guys who are just there, who've already played for a long time. They don't need a bunch of minutes. They're not getting a bunch of minutes. I mean, Udonis Haslem from Miami is kind of an extreme example of that, but that's kind of what you're filling out the back of your bench with. Filling out the back of your bench with a second round pick who's just not developing at all is kind of silly. Teams do it. Don't get me wrong. It could happen, but it's not all that often that that's happening. I think other things that would be tough for him, I think if a team tried to turn him into a small ball 4, I'm not sure if that would work. To me, he's pretty distinctly a 3, maybe even a 2, although there's some athleticism concerns about playing the 2 at the NBA level. Granted, there were about Corey Kispert, and he has played the 2 for the most part at the NBA level. But for Strawther, I think he didn't really play small ball 4 at Gonzaga. There was always rumors that he was going to play that role last year, but Anton Watson emerged as a must-play 30-plus minute per game guy. Ben Gregg emerged as a solid backup, and so Strawther never really needed to fill that small ball 4 role. But I think he could probably do it in the NBA, but I don't think it would be using his skill set the best that they could. So it'll be interesting to see if a team is willing to put him into that spot. And then I think, and this seems very unlikely to happen, but if a team were to put him in a role where he's on ball a lot, that was not his skill set at Gonzaga. He's not a point guard. He's not a facilitator. He's not a distributor. He is an off ball, catch and shoot, catch and attack kind of player. He's a very well-defined role player. And if a team wanted to try to put him outside of that role, that could negatively impact his development. Again, I say I'd be surprised if a team did that, but I talked about this on Tuesday's show. I was absolutely mystified that the Oklahoma City Thunder tried to play Domantas Sabonis as a just catch and shoot big in the corner when that was not in any way, shape, or form his skill set coming out of Gonzaga. So it could happen for Julian. And then low end of outcomes in terms of drafts. Obviously, the worst case scenario for Julian is that he does not get drafted. This seems very surprising to me. He's mocked as high as the late first round, 25 or so. Lowest we're seeing him mocked really is the late 40s. And even then, when I'm reading a mock draft, if I get to 45 and I haven't seen him get picked, it's very surprising. So I'd be surprised if he fell out of the draft. I also was surprised that Joel Ayayi did not get drafted a few years ago. And Joel was a guy who was mocked as high as the 30s and ended up not getting drafted, in part, I think, because he wanted to go undrafted after a certain period of time where he said, I just want to be able to pick my team. Suppose that could happen with Julian. I talked about that potentially happening with Drew as well. But the worst case scenario for Julian is that he does not get drafted. There are a couple other teams that I would not love to see him on. I already mentioned Washington is a not very good fit for Drew Timme because I don't like the way that they're developing players right now, and they've had a negative experience with Rui Hachimura there, and I don't think that they're doing a great job of using Corey Kispert, although he had a lot of success towards the end of last season. Washington picks at both 42 and 57. Again, would be surprised if Strawther was still available at 57, but I'm going to tell you right now, if Strawther's available at 42, I desperately don't want him to go to Washington, in part because the Blazers pick at 43, assuming they still have that pick, and I would love to see him in Portland. That is entirely selfish on my part. I am a diehard Blazers fan. I think the fit is there for him in Portland as well, depending on what happens with Matisse Thybulle and Cam Reddish. But if Washington took him one spot before Portland could, I would have even more reason to dislike the Wizards at that point. I don't love a fit with him for the Charlotte Hornets either. They're kind of a team in a bit of disarray right now, and I'm not sure that he would fit particularly well there. They pick at 34, 39, and 41, though, so there's a decent chance that that's a team that he ends up with, again, assuming they keep all those picks, which seems fairly unlikely. I'd be surprised if Strawther fell below 50, so I think we're looking at him somewhere in that 35 to 50 range, and that's kind of what I want to talk about in the final segment. Where's he actually going to go? What is this going to look like, and what are our projections for his rookie season out of Gonzaga? All that coming up right after this. All right, segment 3, still Andy Patton, still Locked on Zags, still doing our NBA draft previews. Talked about Drew Timme on Tuesday, talking about Julian Strawther here on Wednesday, one day before the 2023 NBA draft takes place on Thursday evening. We talked about some of the best case and worst case scenarios for Julian Strawther in terms of the NBA draft, in terms of his pros and cons and what his role might look like. Now to close out the show, I kind of just want to take a look at what I think is going to happen. My actual predictions for Julian Strawther in terms of location, fit, and actual production for his first professional basketball season. I don't want to give an actual location or an actual team because that's really granular and really specific, but I will say this. I believe that Julian Strawther is going to get picked between 35 and 43. That is the range that I'm comfortable stating for Julian Strawther. I certainly think it's possible he could go higher than 35. I think it's possible, albeit unlikely, that he could fall past 43 as well. Again, I think past 50 would be surprising. At this point, I would be not shocked if he was a first-round pick, but admittedly surprised if he was a first-round pick. I've done a handful of mock drafts myself. It's kind of a nice way to kind of see how willing I am to move a player up or down. And with Julian, there's just a lot of talent in that 20 to 30 range that I think it would be hard for him to kind of crack into. Not impossible, but difficult. From 35 to 43, here are the teams that pick in that range. Boston at 35. Love that fit for him. A contending team, a well-coached team. That would be fun to see for him. Orlando at 36. Again, if they take Grady Dick with one of their first two picks, I doubt he ends up there. But hey, reunion with Jalen Suggs could be a lot of fun in Orlando there. 37, Oklahoma City would be playing behind Santa Clara star Jalen Williams, who emerged as a superstar last year in his rookie season. But of course, the reunion with Chet Holmgren, always fun as well. 38, Sacramento. I'd have to look more at the Kings roster, to be perfectly honest. I think there's probably a fit there as well. Of course, another Zag reunion there with Domantas Sabonis, and just proof that pretty much every team we're talking about has a Zag on them. That is what has happened in the modern NBA. I know Sabonis and Strawther did not play together, obviously, but at this point, all the pro Zags know each other, so it'd be cool to see him end up there. Charlotte at 39. I already said my feelings about Charlotte. 40 is Denver. I don't know that Denver has a big need for a shooting wing, but it would be a really fun fit, of course, to have him in Denver, defending national champions, a team that uses their role players really well. Definitely some optimism if that were to happen for him. 41 is also Charlotte. 42 is Washington. I made it clear I don't really like either of those destinations for Strawther. 43, of course, is Portland, as I talked about in that last segment as well. I ended it there because I really don't want Portland to use that 43rd pick on somebody else if Strawther is available. Of course, it could happen, but it's one of those things that I think that feels like the range that we're going to see Strawther come off the board on Thursday evening. Dream for me is Portland. I made that clear, but there's a lot of other teams in there that I think make a ton of sense for him. And in terms of his actual production as a rookie, I think he's going to avoid a two-way contract. And I don't say that like a two-way contract is an inherently bad thing. I just think that he is more likely to get drafted into a spot where he has a guaranteed roster spot as a rookie. Doesn't mean that he won't play in the G League at times. Perhaps that could happen for him. But to me, I think this is a best case scenario, but I also think a realistic scenario for Julian Strawther is that he is an NBA player from day one. He makes the opening roster. He makes it through training camp. He has one of those 15 spots locked down, and that is where he spends his rookie season. Beyond that, I'm not sure if I see double-digit scorer emerge as an all-rookie candidate like Andrew Nembhard did. Like, I'm not sure I'm willing to go that far. It really depends on team fit. It really depends on who drafts him, what they envision for him, how he does in training camp, who else they draft, all these things that are outside of the ability to make a concrete prediction here on June 20th as we're recording this. But definitely, I think Julian is the kind of guy who will be consistently on the floor in NBA games next season. 8 to 10 minutes per game, maybe 12 minutes per game, maybe not every game. Maybe he still picks up some of those DNP CDs, did not play coach's decision. But by and large, I think Julian Strawther is good enough and has a marketable enough skill that he will get into the NBA and start playing consistently. A player that I've compared it to, and I ran a lot of different searches on Basketball Reference, on the College Reference site, using height and rebounding skills and three-point shooting and all this other stuff to try to find who is most similar to Julian Strawther and how did that player do in the NBA. And I kept running these numbers. I kept changing them, manipulating them, et cetera, et cetera. The player who routinely came up the most was Jordan Nwora. Nwora now with the Indiana Pacers, 13 points per game last year for Indiana in a small sample size. He came over at a trade deadline from Milwaukee, but his rookie season was with the Bucks. He was the 45th player selected in the 2020 NBA draft. So 45 is kind of right around that range. We think Julian could end up getting selected. And as a rookie for the Milwaukee Bucks, Nwora he only played in 30 games. He averaged 9 minutes per game, 5.7 points, 2 boards, shot 45% from deep, and 46.5% on twos. And that honestly feels kind of right. I would like for him to play more than 30 games. Maybe it's more like 45 games, 52 games, something like that. But 9 minutes per game, 6-ish points, a handful of rebounds. It's not, it's not going to shock the world. He's not going to make as many headlines as Andrew Nembhard did as a rookie. Probably not going to make any all-NBA teams, or all-rookie teams, I should say. But it's quality production, especially if you're drafting him in the mid-30s and you get 5 points in 9 minutes. I think you take that. And there's room to grow for Julian, more production. Could he eventually become a double-digit per-game scorer? Yeah, I think so. I don't think it's going to happen as a rookie. It's rare for second-round picks to get up to that level. But do I think Julian Strawther is capable of scoring 10-plus points per game in the NBA? Heck yeah, I do. Heck yeah, you should too. You should too. He is a dynamic bucket getter. That is what he has been since he was in high school in Las Vegas. Throughout his time at Gonzaga, this is a scoring machine. Little reason for me to doubt his ability to score at the next level. There are other things he needs to improve upon, the facilitation, the defense, all that stuff, in order to keep a consistent role. But in terms of him being a guy who can score at the NBA level, I have no doubt that he's going to be able to bring that as soon as his rookie season at the next level. All right, that is going to do it for me today. We are wrapping up our draft profiles. Timmy on Tuesday, Strawther on Wednesday. We'll talk with a fun guest for Thursday, previewing the actual NBA draft as it will be taking place on Thursday evening. And of course, we'll be back on Friday to talk about what happened during the draft and what it means for Timmy Strawther and anybody else who may or may not get selected or signed on draft day. Thank you all for listening. Of course, check out the show wherever you get podcasts. Check us out on YouTube as well, and go hit that subscribe button if you have not done so yet. But until tomorrow, go Zags.